Welcome to Engage ICT. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Where does our water come from, and will we have enough of it in Kansas in 20 or 50 years from now? How can we best ensure that our children and our children's children have the resources that they need? Let's talk about water quantity, water quality, and how to conserve on our way through a drought. Tonight on our panel, we have Libby Albers, Interim Director at the Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams, David Condos, former reporter for the Kansas News Service, and Gary Janzen, Director of Public Works and Utilities for the City of Wichita. Thank you for being with us this evening. And let's start with an overview. A lot of people turn on the tap and get a glass of water, and then that's the extent of their thought behind it. Would you, Gary, just sort of step in with a quick explanation of where our water comes from, particularly for those who live in Wichita? How does it work? How do we get the water that we have?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind. Thank you, Sarah Jane. We have two primary water supplies for most of the Wichita region and the metro area. Wichita has 15 partners within the region, including wholesale and retail customers. So we serve about 500,000 people within the region. But those two primary water supply sources are from Cheney Reservoir and the Equisbeds, what's considered the walnut part of the Equisbeds within the Highland Plains, within the Highland Aquifer. So those two sources have been our primary source for a long time. We've got a few things that we've done over time with the Equisbeds to help sustain it long term, but we were able to treat a mixture of both of those sources, and we're currently building a new water treatment plant that's going to add to the flexibility that we can use either one of those sources at any different time.
And if we could expand that up into like the statewide view, David, can you explain where rural Kansas gets their water from primarily?
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of Western Kansas specifically, rural Western Kansas, it would mostly be the Ogallala Aquifer. So if you drive across Western Kansas, not a whole lot of water on the surface, streams, reservoirs, that sort of thing. So most of the water is coming from underground. That's for cities, for drinking water, and for everything else, for businesses, industrial, and primarily, obviously, agriculture, irrigation of crops. And so, yeah, that's connected to the Equisbeds that have been mentioned that serve other parts of the state, but they're really different animals in terms of how deep they are, how much water is in there, how quickly or not quickly they refill or recharge. And so yeah, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, obviously the thing with Western Kansas is that there aren't really those backup options of, if you're a city, you'd like to have a reservoir and just some groundwater options and, some kind of, overlapping options that you could use if one of them has problems. And once you get further west, it really starts to become more and more of just that groundwater from the Ogallala.
And we'll get into well water a little bit more as we chat this evening, but if someone has a well, does it access Ogallala or the Equisbeds? Is that what it's accessing?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on where they are exactly. I mean, you can also have like they call alluvial aquifers. If you were right next to a stream bed, then you might have a personal well or a well for your farm or your land that is maybe closer to the surface and is a little bit different in that maybe it does have a little bit more recharge if it is connected with a stream bed. So yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are. But yeah, when you're talking about Western Kansas and you think about like center pivot irrigation, most of those, not all of them, are going to be connected to the deeper waters of the Ogallala.
Okay. And Libby, on this first question of where our water comes from, is there any piece of this that we kind of haven't discussed yet, just in that 101 level of explaining how we get our water?
Like David said, out west, you're mostly going to be going for the groundwater. In eastern Kansas, a lot of the reservoirs that are built in the state are drinking water reservoirs. And there's different protections because of that need to supply those eastern Kansas cities with safe and reliable drinking water. So because of the extra rain, we have more surface water. So it really is two completely different states that we live in the way that water behaves.
Very interesting. Okay, so now let's go into an overview that I want each of you to weigh in on how you would describe the current state of the water supply in Kansas, both in quantity and in quality. If you would kind of explain how big a problem we're facing statewide, David, can you talk about that?
Sure, yeah, and again, my expertise is more in Western Kansas, so yeah, like was just said, it really is two different states when you think about where the water is coming from and how much there is and all that. But yeah, I mean, overall in Western Kansas, I would sum it up as unsustainable in some ways. Just, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, it's the amount of water that's being used in most of Western Kansas is not to where experts like the Kansas Geological Survey would say is at a long-term sustainable point for the aquifer. And there are obviously success stories. I got to report on some of them where in some local areas, landowners, irrigators would come together and say, hey, we see this as a problem. We want to, reduce to get closer to that level of sustainability. And there's been some success with that. But yeah, I don't think anybody would say that it's there yet when you're talking, especially when you're talking about 50 years down the road or something like that. And I should clarify, for the Ogallala, what I've been told is that, it's not as much of a risk of municipal water running dry just because municipal water uses so much less than agriculture for irrigation. So even if the, one part of the Ogallala became especially depleted and large scale irrigation was not really possible, it couldn't support the gallons per minute that it had previously, and large scale irrigation is no longer possible. Probably drinking water would still be possible just because the amount of gallons that are used for municipal drinking uses are so much less than the large scale irrigation. So how it's been explained to me is the first thing that would be hit with depletion in the West would be the large scale irrigation, and that might go away. And you might still be able to get drinking water, but if the large scale irrigation goes away, that's such a big part of the local economy, and so much is based around that, that would still hurt the towns, even if they still had municipal water access.
So farming and ranching is the thing that's in trouble because of the depleting of the Ogallala aquifer.
Yeah, I would say primarily, yeah. I mean, and primarily farming. It's the irrigation of crops is what uses the biggest share of the water. In some of these parts of Western Kansas, it's 90%, 95% of all water goes to irrigate crops. But obviously that impacts livestock. A lot of those crops are being raised for livestock feed, and so those all kind of create this ecosystem that is dependent on the water. Yeah.
Okay. Libby, how about you? What about the other kind of water in the state of Kansas? What is your
Sure.
perspective?
Surface water also faces some challenges with lifespans of the reservoirs that were built. Some of the reservoirs are behaving really well. And when I say that behaving, they are retaining the water that they need for both recreation as well as to sustain those drinking water sources for the municipalities, the communities that are around there. There are other ones, though, that are filling with sediment more rapidly than had been projected. That sediment running off of land, uncovered land, is probably the biggest challenge right now, and where a lot of groups are putting their activities and their dollars and trying to hold that land in place and keep it on the ground on the agricultural uses versus at the bottom of a reservoir.
What makes a river or a stream behave well versus?
One of the things that that happens a lot right now, and it's just related to decades of changes. We thought we knew best. Our grandparents thought they knew best doing what they were doing, and we learn as we go. So some of the straightening out or channelization of the streams make them flow faster. They make them flashier. They move water quicker and pick up sediments quicker. Versus those streams meandering and slowly letting that water absorb into an alluvial aquifer, a shallow aquifer. That takes up a lot of space on somebody's ground, letting those streams meander around. But it's what they were meant to do, and just moving that water off super quickly, especially in a rural area where you don't have the city infrastructure. Moves a lot of sediment, and a lot of those nutrients from the fields go with it.
So a couple generations ago, or whenever this was,
Yeah,
people were
it's
trying
been
to be more efficient
Yeah.
and save
And
space and save time, and
I'm
and it
sure
just
my
didn't allow.
grandchildren, yes, I'm sure my grandchildren will look back and go, why did they do what they did?
Well, yeah.
We're learning as we go. Yeah.
Yep, that's very interesting. Now, Gary, what do you think on the state of our water quantity, but maybe for you, it might be more about quality? How does the city look at this issue?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about both. So on the quantity side, we're being the most impacted on our surface water supply from Cheney Reservoir, right? The drought's gone for about a year now. Current precipitation in the area is about 5 inches below normal for this time of year. So Cheney itself, the conservation pool is down about 4 feet. As a result of where that conservation pool is out, we have activated stage 1 of our drought response plan. Now, the drought response plan applies to all of our customers and was put in place after the most recent drought between roughly 2011 and 2013. And what that does, that drought response plan and who it impacts, is it puts in place several measures to help us hopefully sustain long term. The first is voluntary conservation. So we have a call to our customers and citizens to do everything they can to conserve. We have a rebate program that provides funding for water efficient fixtures and appliances and things like that. And then we also have an internal conservation plan that we put in place across the organization, right? That conservation plan also applies to our wholesale partners, those that we supply water to, but we work within our organization. Everything that we do across the city of Wichita to try to save water, whether it's in parks, our own facilities, anything that we can do we really want to lead the way, right? And show that we're taking serious the need to conserve. So all of those things need to be done, because when we have an impact to our surface water source, like we do now with Cheney, it's going to impact municipal users first and foremost. And as we head towards stage 2 of our drought response plan, which right now we're triggering towards the end of this year, if the weather patterns don't change much, that goes to a mandatory restriction on outdoor water use to 1 day a week. And you can imagine that has a pretty big impact on a community of our size. It could be if we start to see bigger issues within the Equus beds itself, that could also impact agricultural users. But right now, our focus is really on Cheney and the Cheney watershed. So that's from a quantity standpoint. I'll talk about quality real quick. We have for some time been a part of multiple programs to help with water quality within these basins, especially within Cheney. So we are part of the RAP program that we work with K-State, and that's within the Little Ark River Basin and Cheney, to help with sediment, to help with projects for overall water quality. We are part of a program within the Cheney Basin itself to reduce sedimentation by implementation of best management practices to reduce sediment and phosphates into Cheney. Libby talked about that a little bit, and I think most people understand the impacts over time of what those can do for water quality. The third part I want to mention is something that we're really proud of that Wichita and Sedgwick County has implemented in the last several years, is what we call an off-site BMP program for best management practices. And what it does is it helps reduce sediment from construction projects into our waterways. It uses funding from projects to allow farmers to implement no-till farming in the upland reaches of our rivers. And so far, we think it's done quite a bit. That program was approved by KDHE. It's something that we've had other people say that they want to start looking at and taking off with. So we've got quite a few measures in place right now that we hope will help on both the quality and the quantity side, but we still need it to rain in the right places, no matter what.
So the drought is one factor. David, I want to come back to you and ask how, from what you've learned, how we got to this state out in western Kansas. How much does drought contribute to the Ogallala aquifer being depleted? Is that a little factor, not much of a factor? Does the rainwater get into the aquifer at any point in time?
Yeah, it does. And so as opposed to like the Equus beds, so a lot of the Ogallala water when you get to western Kansas is very deep, like hundreds and hundreds of feet deep. And so the water does get there eventually, but it might take 10 years for it to get there. And one of the last stories I did was in Wallace County in far western Kansas, and Kansas Geological Survey told me that in that area, I think water is being used at a rate 9 times of how it's being replenished. And so like drought does have an impact, but it's more the immediate factor. Yeah, well, the immediate impact of drought in western Kansas is that people have to pump more in order to keep a crop alive. And so if they have the water, it's the choice between, do I just let this whole field fail and just leave it out, or do I water it and try to save it? Or, I mean, this is getting like really complicated, but like if they have crop insurance, they might have to continue watering it in order to abide by the agreement that they have with that crop insurance. And so, yeah, and so the immediate impact of drought in a place like western Kansas is more that because there's less precipitation falling down, farmers are pushed to supplement that with more pumping from the aquifer. And so there are effects as far as the recharge and the precipitation actually filtering down, but those are a little bit longer term, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so it's 9 times more use than it is being replenished. When did that start? Like, how long has it been like that? And what brought this on?
Yeah, well, the good news is that I don't know what that particular number was, 50 years ago, but it's almost certainly much better now than it was 50 years ago. Because, I mean, you think about how irrigation used to happen. It used to be a lot of flood irrigation, which, just to kind of like paint a picture for that's just like, and some that's still, it's more rare, but this is still used. It's not like this is ancient stuff. So that's like, in long rows of water, flooding in between the crops is an example of that, just to help people visualize it, as opposed to the center pivot irrigation. And so like the actual, the methods of irrigation have gotten more efficient. But yeah, I mean, it's still a ton of water being used. I mean, you look at statewide and you think there's big cities in eastern Kansas or central Kansas, still a vast majority of all the water being used in the state is still coming from the Ogallala aquifer and going to irrigate crops in more rural areas. So it's still a lot of water. And as far as how it got here, I mean, that's, that was one of the last stories I did, was looking at some of the legislation that was coming through the State House related to trying to push more conservation with groundwater management districts and things like that. And part of the history that I was talking with people about, as far as the policy history, was that that in a lot of ways this was a planned depletion, and that was how it was built in to the law, was that and I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head, I apologize, but it's like if you could use it at a rate that would eventually deplete the aquifer, in 50 years from now, then that was okay. And again, I'm not sure if those numbers are correct, but it was something that was like, well, it was built into the policies that eventually it would deplete. And 50 years seems like a long time, But, you know, here we are today and dealing with some of those issues. And now, you know, when I talked with people in Western Kansas to try to envision 50 years from now, I mean, that's like, it's really hard because, you know, we don't know. I mean, that's a long time and a lot of things can happen. And also, like I said, with so little water on the surface, it's just hard to think about like what happens if you know, that goes away for a certain area. It's really the, you know, that underground water is really the lifeblood of that region.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it's interesting that it's like not as bad now as it used to be, but we aren't into a sustainable model at the moment. I mean, do you think that we are getting there?
Yeah, I mean, different people are going to have different opinions about that. I mean, some people look at like the legislation I reference and say like, oh, well, that's not nearly enough. And other people would look at it and say like, hey, this is a first step. Like you've got to take a first step in order to do anything, like to get to the next step. And I would probably, you know, fall in that second camp. Not saying that this legislation was good or bad, but just in general, I think, I mean, if this is what you can get people to get on board with and actually, like talking about irrigators, if this is what you can get, you know, people to actually get on board with now, then that's better than nothing, better than having the discussions fizzle out and you wait another year and kick the can down the road. So yeah, I don't know, but like I said, it's still not to, you know, when you look at the big picture, it's still not to sustainable levels. I think the Kansas Geological Survey, when I was talking to them about GMD1, which is kind of West Central Kansas, I think they were saying they'd have to reduce water use by around 1/3 in order to get to sustainable levels in a normal year. And in a drought year like we've had, it would be closer to reducing by 1/2, which is a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a lot of water, and it's going to take a lot of changes. Like I said, it's not just that, you know, oh, hey, that farmer needs to, you know, shut off his tap. I mean, it's like big changes about like, well, hey, what kind of crops are we going to grow? What kind of crops are we going to subsidize, or what kind of like, even like I did a story on cotton, like what kind of infrastructure can we build to make it easier for farmers to take a risk on trying a new crop that maybe uses less water. And so, yeah, it's just, there's a lot of kind of systemic factors there as well.
Gary, I want to come back to you and ask, because you've mentioned these programs and plans that were in drought phase. What did you say, 1 or 2? One, response to the drought. When were these plans put in place? I'm trying to think, what was it, 10 years ago or so that we had a pretty bad drought then as well? How long has the city been working toward this system that they have now?
So, you know, I was able to look back in time. We actually had a water conservation plan in place as early as 1991 that contemplated looking long-term at what we call an integrated local water supply plan, looking at conservation goals, looking at a drought response plan. Not all of that happened at that time, but there were state programs that were put in place that required especially communities the size of Wichita to start looking at conservation. I can tell you from my perspective in kind of recent past, the drought we went through roughly in 2011, 2012, that we came out of in 2013 was really a call to action for us and for our elected officials that we knew we wanted to do something. So it was that point in time that our city council formally adopted our drought response plan as part of the city code. It includes 4 stages of the drought response plan, and it all is dependent on the amount of water that's in Cheney Reservoir. Because of that surface water source being an integral part of what we do, it has the most impact on our ability to supply water to, again, almost 500,000 people within the Wichita region. So we have that plan that's been in place since 2013. We haven't had to activate the drought response plan much since then. We've been fortunate. But again, we're headed towards stage 2 now, depending on what happens with rain, particularly in the Cheney Basin. But we have done a tremendous amount of outreach to the community. And again, I just want to mention we have an internal conservation plan that's part of that. and we want to show the community that we're doing everything we can within the city facilities, at parks, at fields, things like that. Wherever it is, construction projects, we're trying to limit the water use. It's really taken a lot of effort from all of us to take a real fresh look at this and decide that we want to show what we can do to lead the way. The rebate program is a big part of that, to incentivize folks to get water saving appliances. They can get a portion of their cost back on that. So I think we're learning as we go some things that we can do in addition to this. It's not a good situation that we're in, but I think it's good that we're all paying attention again and realizing that this needs to be a part of what we do long term so it can be sustainable, right? I just want to mention again, we are building a new water treatment plant that should come online in late 2024, early 2025. That treatment plant is going to have a lot more flexibility than our current treatment plant does. That's reaching almost 90 years old. We will have the ability to treat 100% groundwater, which is something that we couldn't do in the past. So that alone is a really big deal for us looking into the future. So I think we've done a lot to really, again, I mentioned before, reduce our vulnerability to these extreme events. But we've still got a long ways to go. We need to keep the message out there, and we need to keep pushing forward. And hopefully we'll see some, they're talking about El Nino this summer and seeing a wetter than normal summer. So that's what we'll hope for. That's what it took to come out of the drought in 2013.
Very good. Libby, from your perspective at the Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Stream, what are the challenges that you are trying to combat through that organization? What are the things that you see Kansas struggling with and that your organization is working to combat?
That's a big question. I wanted to say something about Western Kansas too.
Yeah, go ahead.
We think so much about the irrigation that comes up, the water that we see coming out of the machines when we're driving along the highway, maybe through Western Kansas. But if there are ways that we can increase some of that shallow water or the water that's held in the soils out in Western Kansas, educating folks on playas. Kansas has over 20,000 playas out in Western Kansas, and these are shallow wetland depressions that are only fed by rainwater when we get some of the nice storms that have come through Western Kansas. And they do some shallow recharge there, which can help with the grazing lands. It can help with the crops around there. There's also some other surface activities that are taking place to not necessarily touch the water that's hundreds of feet down, but that shallow water that's available, and that's removing some of the invasive plants. They're called phreatophytes because they tap into that shallow aquifer. So these are invasive trees like salt cedar and tamarisk. If we can remove those where they have encroached, especially on the Ark River Basin, they will quit sucking up so much water, and that water will be available for the prairie grasses and for the soil health. And I know Gary touched on it just a little bit there with he referred to a RAPS program, a Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy program. This has been around for about 20 years, and it's put out through Kansas Department of Health and Environment. We have 6 of the RAPS programs that we implement mostly in eastern Kansas around those drinking water reservoirs. And they tie back most recently in the last several years to soil health. And I think Gary touched on that a little bit too. And you think, well, why would soil health improve water quality and water quantity? But if you can have the soil behaving the way it should, with all of its diverse microbes and the root structures that go down there, it will hold water, and it will allow water to percolate through it, to filter out, to hold the nutrients in place rather than letting them and the sediment rush down to the creeks and the rivers and the reservoirs. So improving soil health is actually one of the biggest pushes right now in water quality and water quantity.
That is so interesting. I have an anonymous listener question that I want to direct to you as well, Libby. This person says that there is a salt plume headed this direction that may affect the viability of streams and drinking water, and they're just looking for you to comment on that. How big of a problem is this going to be? Where
This
is
is one
it?
that Gary,
When will it arrive? Yeah, go ahead.
this is one that Gary could probably touch on as well. Some of those salt plumes, some of them are tied to old oil extraction practices, or the reinjection of the waste salt water that has moved out of where it was supposed to go down in the Arbuckle Formation. Some things are natural, coming out of the Hutchison area where you have salt coming towards the surface, but they might be talking about the one that's up near the Equus beds. And from what I understand with the Equus beds is they're really trying to create that hydraulic pressure against the salt plume. So making sure that the water is recharged. That was one of the big recharge projects up there. It's on the Little Arc. Is that right, Gary?
Yes, correct.
It's on the Little Arc, and by putting that water pressure against the salt plume, it's keeping the salt from migrating down into where those wells are that pull in the city of Wichita's water.
Very interesting. Do you want to add to that any, Gary?
Libby explained that really well. I thought about mentioning that earlier on when we were talking about water quality. So she explained that well. It comes from oil and gas exploration. A lot of people are familiar with the salt mines and Hutch. Some of it's naturally occurring, but we do have several things in place, including what we call bank injection wells, where we take water from the Little Arc River and pump it back into the ground, effectively creating that hydraulic wall, if you will. It's not stopping the plume, but it is slowing it down. We've seen some success. The plume is still moving east, southeast from where it's at. And in time, over quite a few years, but it's still going to happen. It is going to start to impact the quality of the water within the Equus beds, within Groundwater Management District 2, which will impact not only the ability to provide drinking water in the future, but also for agricultural uses. But we're continuing to look at that. I think we're hoping that we can find maybe new technology and innovation in the future that could help, because that is going to have a big impact in the future.
Is this something that might kind of hit our area in a year or 10? What? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think the best we can project now of the impact as far as getting even into where our Equus beds wells are at, northwest of Wichita in the Halstead-Bentley area, it's probably still 50 years.
Oh.
We're talking about something on the measure of it moving a foot a year. It doesn't seem like much, but it's moving. And we don't know if that pattern is going to persist or if that'll change, but we're doing everything we can to keep an eye on that. We're working with GMD too, because everybody has within their best interest to try to do what we can to control that.
And as we know, 50 years can go by rather quickly.
It does.
I have another audience question that I would like to share for you, David. This person says, assuming that there's little to no change in drawing down the Ogallala Aquifer, when is it projected to run dry? And are ag producers doing anything to rein water use for crops? And we talked about that a little bit, but maybe if there are some new things going on there.
Yeah, that's like the simple question that a lot of people want, and it's not a simple answer because the aquifer is so different. You're talking about the Equus beds difference with the Ogallala. Even in the Ogallala, it's so different because it's, some parts are really deep, some parts are just kind of deep, and some parts have thicker. So you think about it, it's the depth from the surface, but it's also the depth to water, where the water level is now, and then how much water there is, below that, because some areas are really deep, like they've been used a lot. The level has dropped a lot, but they still have the most. So that's like in Southwest Kansas, for example, some parts have lost the most, but they also still have a lot left. And then in Northwest Kansas, it's a little bit thinner, like their layer of water maybe isn't quite as thick. And so I don't know, like, I mean, I've heard 3 decades, 5 decades. I mean, it really depends, or longer in some cases. But yeah, it really depends geographically. I mean, even like within a county, it can vary a lot. And I mean, as far as, the farmers adapting, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, some of them have kind of banded together to do these local enhanced management areas, which is something that all farmers have an option to do. That's a statewide thing. And they band together to voluntarily kind of set their own limits. And some folks in Northwest Kansas have been doing that for a while and shown a good amount of success, even in the amount of profitability that they have, even with reducing their water use. And then some parts of West Central Kansas have just started recently in the last year or two. And the West Central Kansas ones are larger geographic areas. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what the results are for the farmers that are participating in that. And then of course, individual farmers, a lot of them are adapting just because they have to. Like, I mean, I've interviewed farmers who's like, well, yeah, this well and running dry again is tough because like I said, like it may still have enough to support like, drinking water for a house or something, but it can't support, a center pivot irrigation system anymore. But yeah, like, I mean, like I said, I talked with, farmers who, they had a well run dry and it's like, well, this is no longer an irrigated field. This is now a dryland field and I'm adapting and I'm, then the next season you plant differently. You choose a different type of seed, you space out the seeds more, maybe you can change some of your other practices to conserve more water in the soil. And so, yeah, I mean, I think even farmers who may not, consider themselves, big time environmental conservationists in that sense of the word, a lot of them are adapting just because that's what they see in front of them. They know their land and they're having to adapt. But yeah, like I said, still, when you look at the big picture, there's still a lot of unsustainable numbers that don't quite line up. If you're talking about, is the aquifer going to be here, 50 or 100 years from now? So there's still more work to be done. Yes.
And kind of a side question here, but thinking about water quality, are there things that contribute to water quality in an aquifer, or is it just the way it is and nothing kind of affects?
Yeah, no. I mean, it is like, so I didn't cover that quite as much as I did water quantity, but I did some and yeah, like nitrate can get in aquifer and that can be from farm fertilizer. There's also naturally occurring stuff. There's parts of Western Kansas that have arsenic, uranium, stuff like that, that they've had to deal with. And the tricky thing with that is that, or two things. One is like, if, nitrate, for example, gets in, a deeper aquifer, my understanding is that it's harder to like get it out, like there's, because the water isn't moving a lot. It's not like, you think about like a stream or watershed or something. It's just everything works a little bit slower when it's way down there. And then the other thing is that as the water quantity decreases, the concentrations of those chemicals increases. So like if you just think about like you have a bottle of water, and if you put like a little bit of, some chemical in there and you got a full bottle of water, there's just less of it in every, gulp you take from that water. But then if you add that same amount of chemical to a bottle of water that's, only a fourth full, it would be a lot more concentrated. And so those are connected, like the quality and the quantity are connected in that way, that as the aquifer depletes, those quality issues can become more of an issue because there's just less water for it to spread out.
Yeah, very interesting. I have a really interesting listener question here that I want to share as well. this person says, Integra has announced it will expand manufacturing of microchips dependent on the finalization of grants. These facilities use 2 to 4 million gallons of water per day. And I'm concerned this much water diverted to one manufacturer will cause our city water rates to increase and or create water scarcity for residents. So if Integra proceeds with its expansion, how will the city water department prepare for a significant increase in water usage as well as wastewater? This is from Randy. And Gary, can you address that question?
Yeah, I sure can. We are in the middle of looking at that right now. You know, the Integra plant is in Bel Air. We're working with the city of Bel Air, working with their engineers. We're doing some modeling right now because we've seen those same numbers you talked about. So, you know, on average, we treat and provide up to 60 million gallons a day of water through our water treatment plant. So 2 to 4 million gallons a day is not insignificant. However, so far, what we've looked at in our modeling is, from a water perspective, we think that we can handle that well. There's some changes we'll have to make in what we call our northeast zone. When you start getting a little farther out to the edges of where they're at Rock Road and K254, which is again in Bel Air, there's some things we'll have to do to be able to get water to them, right? But we're working on that now, and we don't see that that's going to be really that detrimental at this point in time. It won't affect rates. We just got to make sure from a sustainability standpoint that we can provide that kind of water. So again, looking long term, we've got to do everything we can to keep up with conservation, to make sure that as places like Integra are added, as we see a value to the community and the region, we do want to be able to provide those resources, and we think we can. You mentioned wastewater. The water's got to go somewhere, right? So we're modeling that at the same time too. We effectively have models of our systems that we can put different scenarios into to have a better understanding of the needs for pressure and volume at any point in time. We think we can handle it from a perspective of sewer treatment also. A couple things that are happening within our system that are helping with this is, I don't want to keep bringing it up as too much of a sales point, but our new water treatment plant is going to provide us more ability to do some of these things in the future and to continue to provide for growth of our community and our region. On the sewer side, we're not limited, but we are taking a closer look at that because where the Integra plant is in particular, we don't have any sewer treatment plants really too close to that area. So we've got to make sure we've got a capacity within our distribution system and our collection system to get it to where the treatment facilities are. Right now, we're not seeing any real red flags or any major issues, but we're continuing to push through that.
Kim, who is watching this now, asks, will Integra cover these costs? Is that part of the negotiations?
I think that's part of everything that we're looking at. And right now, we don't even know what the cost will be. From a cost of water perspective, they're going to be like any other customer, right? So certainly they would do that. If there's additional infrastructure needs, we haven't figured out really what that looks like yet. But that's something we'll get to. We're going to need to get to in pretty short order because of when they're wanting to be online in 2025.
I see another listener question coming through, but while that's coming, I want to ask you a question from Mary Ann, who emailed in this question. I feel like it relates a little bit. She asks, what are the legal and political roadblocks to the use of gray water in Sedgwick County?
I don't know that there's necessarily any legal roadblocks. So anybody who's talked about gray water or reuse water, the first thing they talk about, right, is the ick factor, meaning that depending on what you're going to use it for, if you're going to consider domestic use, a lot of people, their first thought was, this is water that's coming from a sewer treatment plant, and they don't have a lot of interest in that. I will tell you, the city of Phoenix, because they're dealing with drought issues like a lot of the western part of the country, is taking a very serious look at gray water reuse. In fact, they've got quite a few programs in place to do that. There's some other larger cities in the country that have done that. We currently have at our, what I would call our main treatment plant, sewer treatment plant at the south end of Wichita. We have an agreement with Spirit to provide gray water to them for their manufacturing use, their processing use. That helps with some of our conservation, that they're using reused water. We haven't gotten too far into that conversation yet, but I think it's one of the tools in our toolbox over time. If you start to see, if we were to start seeing drought conditions that persisted for years and years and years and became so extreme that became something we need to look at, then I think we would. Until that point in time, we're going to keep an eye on it. We're going to see if it makes sense in certain areas. Everything that we've done to this point, everything that I've talked about that we've put in place with this new water treatment plant, with what we've done with the Equisbeds. Libby mentioned a little bit about our recharge project, which I didn't talk about a lot because I could talk for hours just on that alone. That also provides our ability to manage water within the Equisbeds for many years to come. We believe everything we're putting in place in Wichita right now will help us sustain what's considered to be a 1% drought, a 100-year drought, no different than what was in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl, that we can sustain during that time and not get past stage 2 of our drought response plan. If we can do that, we're in a pretty good place.
The question that just came through is from Jessica on Facebook. So kind of staying in this general theme here. She asks, with the construction of Wichita's new water facility and the city's overall building standards, what type of sustainable practices are being used when it comes to recycling rainwater, for example, and the like?
You know, I don't know that within our current building codes or practices that there's anything specifically in place for the reuse of rainwater. It's encouraged. We've seen people do it, especially on the residential side. I don't know so much on the commercial side, but I think it's all part of recognizing and encouraging sustainability across the community. We have a sustainability integration board now, I think, that really has a desire to look at those types of things long term and make recommendations to the city council of where they see potential improvements could be. And we could possibly see it in an area like that.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone earlier today about having this conversation this evening. And they were talking about rain barrels and wondering just how much does having a rain barrel help? Like, how much does that really contribute? But it's something that people can do. Do you think that's just something you would kind of encourage for everyone?
Yeah, I think that, again, we've seen it more kind of a viable use for residential properties, but I'm stating the obvious here, but we haven't had a lot of rain since last August. So that it would have been good here the last month or two to capture some of the rain that we've gotten for sure. We haven't seen that. I think that is something that proves to be completely viable across everything that we do. But again, it's always part of the plan. It's part of the tools in the toolbox I talked about before. And it's something we would encourage anybody to look at.
I have a comment from Dana here. She says, I've told my children as they grew up and moved out to eventually locate somewhere without water scarcity. It will be a major problem in their lifetimes. I think securing Wichita's water future will be one step towards keeping young professionals in Wichita. And I think that's an interesting comment. I wonder how, what your reaction to that is, considering that Wichita is taking these measures. Is it not as bad as people think, or 50 years from now, are we still going to be making those tough decisions in the Wichita area?
Well, that's a really great point. And we're always, whether it's water or otherwise, we're always focused on trying to keep people here, right? But everything that I've talked about and everything that we're doing, and I talked about going back to the early 90s and our integrated local water supply plan, we have started to position ourselves to be here where we're at now. still don't like going through these drought conditions. We're still facing challenges. We're not out of the woods by any means. The drought response plan, the stage 1 of that we're in, is calling for conservation from across the community and 500,000 people in the Wichita region that count on water. So that's still got to be in place. I mentioned before that I think that this is a good reminder to all of us going forward, no matter what we're doing, even with the infrastructure that we've put in place. Our city council over the course of, I think, the last 20 years have done a tremendous job of looking at the funding needs, of looking at the rate structure that it takes. We've done some pretty innovative things. If you look at our tiered rate structure for what people pay for water and sewer, at one time, the more water you use, the less that it costs, right? By basic economy of scale. We reversed that to encourage conservation. So now by our tiered rate structure, it encourages conservation based on your average winter consumption. So we look at 4 months during the winter as the average consumption. And anytime that you use outside of that, above that, you moved into the next tier and you pay more for water. So what that really does is, getting into the warmer months, it encourages everyone to try to conserve, especially with outdoor water use, where you're going to pay more for the water. So we have done, I think, so many things to really help ourselves out, but we've got a long ways to go. Again, I don't want to portray that we're necessarily out of the woods here. We have done a lot with public outreach. I mentioned before, we've shown pictures of Cheney Reservoir, not to necessarily provide a scare factor, but to remind folks that we are in a drought and we all need to be part of this and encourage them again to look at conservation going forward.
David, I wonder what your thoughts are on that comment, but directed more at Western Kansas. How big of a hurdle do you think water scarcity is going to be for the economy in Western Kansas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will change. I mean, when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about something long-term, like 50 years, like I said, I think there will be a lot more of the example I was saying earlier where, farmer sees, this well isn't viable anymore for irrigation, so this can be a dry land field now. And I think you'll just see a lot more of that. And I think a lot of farmers I talk to are aware of that and are up for that, and they're ready to do what they need to do to keep the farm that has been in their family for 4 or 5 generations going. So, I don't think it's necessarily, that you're going to see it all go to dust and all that. I think you'll just see a lot of changes in farming practices, but out of necessity. And again, that could mean different crops, and that that gets into bigger questions of, like, even if you don't live in Western Kansas, what kind of food do you consume? Like, what kind of food systems do we want to create, as a state or as a nation, that kind of incentivize growing corn or something that needs a lot more water versus things that don't. But yeah, when you're thinking about, like, young people wanting to stay, I mean, I think, I think it's just going to be, who's up for, doing things a little bit different than their grandpa did and trying their own thing. And I think the people that want to do that, I think if they want to keep farming, I think they'll have opportunities to do that.
Libby, what do you think is something on this topic that people don't understand or that they just need to know that isn't commonly known for people who aren't looking at our rivers and streams and our water overall every day?
I think kind of as we're coming up on an hour now, that folks need to realize that there are a lot of people looking at water and looking at the challenges that are out there and looking at how new practices can be implemented, whether it's some of the technology farms that the Kansas Water Office is experimenting with agricultural producers that are testing and trying new techniques and new pieces of equipment, whether it's small nonprofits that are on the ground, just doing real hands-on labor to try to improve the water quality and water quantity. If it's municipalities, looking at ways to conserve water, looking at the challenges that are unique to municipalities, maybe not completely unique, but when you have an urban density and you have different manufacturing and commercial businesses that can impact the water and the water below the surface, especially in eastern Kansas, where it's closer to the surface. There are so many creative ideas out there to help address these issues that have been coming up tonight. It's not, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but there are so many people that see these challenges and are asking, well, what can we do next? What if we did this? What if we did that? You know, how can putting a cover crop over a barren piece of farm ground, how could that improve water quality? You know, how could fencing out cattle from this part of the stream? Or what if we irrigated a golf course with wastewater effluent? You know, are there ways that we can keep eating the elephant, you know, keep taking bites out of this, because it is a big issue and it's not going away, and it is going to be a challenge that's faced by our kids and our grandkids.
People are always so afraid of sounding Pollyanna-ish, but it does seem like the way to get something done is for a lot of people to do just a little bit of something. So I'm all for it. My last question that I want to address to each of you is, what can people do if they want to help save water for Kansas? Your top tips, maybe 1 or 2 tips that you can share for people to either help conserve quantity-wise or help preserve the quality of the water in Kansas. And Gary, why don't you go first?
I think I would simply talk about outdoor water use, especially in a metro area the size of Wichita. We just see the desire for plush green grass and an overuse of water. Now, you know, some of those are on well water, which effectively over time is not having a lot of impact from a residential perspective. However, not everybody is. Some are tied into city water. And so where we're at right now, we're encouraging conservation, especially on outdoor water use. That's really going to go a long ways for us with the number of people we have in our community and how much water is used outside. We've done things, I mentioned before about internal conservation plan. We shut down our fountains recently to show that, again, it's not a good use of the water during this time. So that's where our focus is going to continue to be for now.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just on a regular residential scale thing. I mean, I lived in Hayes when I was in Kansas, and I covered this a little bit, but Hayes is known within water circles for the emphasis that it has placed on conservation at a residential scale, because Hayes, and I don't need to get too much into it, but Hayes is kind of in between east and west. So like they don't have the deep aquifer access, but they still don't have a lot of precipitation. And so they've over the years, they've really incentivized kind of changing that culture around, well, we don't need the plush grass, and they've had a turf buyback program where they'll, you know, pay you to switch your grass over to, or switch your irrigated grass over to something that doesn't need as much irrigation, or something that's a mix of native plants. And again, like that's for Hayes kind of because they've had to, because they're in this specific situation, but anybody living anywhere can do that. Like you can, you know, switch out your lawn for something else, or, you know, if that's drastic, you can just start, if you're buying a new plant, you can buy a native, more drought tolerant plant, bush, whatever it is, instead of whatever the other one is. And so it's just like, you know, just taking a second to think about that, like in a little decision like that. And if a lot of people do that, then that can, you know, maybe make a difference. And then, you know, if a if a farmer is spending their time listening to a water panel at, on their evening, then I can't tell them anything that they don't already know. But yeah, I mean, just in general, like, I think there's still a lot of, low hanging fruit when it comes to the irrigation, and like some of the ones that I talked to who had done those kind of voluntary reduction programs, they were saying like, before we did this, we just didn't think about how much water we're using, because over the last several decades, it's been like, well, there's just all this water, we're just going to use it, and it seems like it's just going to be never ending. And so I think, again, even just changing that mindset of like, well, hey, if I can reduce 10% or whatever, maybe I'll find out that I didn't really need that 10%. That's what some of these farmers found out, that they reduced, and it didn't end up making that big of a difference in their bottom line. And so I think there's still little things that can be done that maybe don't need to be quite so drastic.
Well, and maybe talking to homeowners associations about front lawns, because I think a lot of them have rules that are not conducive to sustainability. But
sure. And that's why it worked in Hayes that they've done this over the years, and now it's like not a thing. Like, there's a lot of ugly lawns in Hayes, and so it becomes less of a thing. And then there's more pressure if, especially in a drought like this, if your lawn is the really green lawn, then it's kind of like people are looking at you like, hey, like, you're not, we know what you're doing. So yeah, it's about changing that mindset, I think.
Okay, Libby, how about you?
Yeah, echoing what David said as well, some other tips, especially in the urban areas, is, man, if you've got a leaky faucet, fix a leaky faucet. It just, so many gallons go down the drain before you realize it, or a toilet that's constantly running that burns through more water than you would believe. Switching out those things out in your landscape if you can, or as you could put in natives, that's fantastic. From a quality standpoint, remember, especially in a place like Wichita, where the stormwater drains are all plumbed eventually to get to the river, that we all have riverfront property. So whatever ends up in the storm drain or on the parking lot is probably going to end up down into one of the tributaries or down into the river. So don't push the grass clippings out onto the road. Just those kind of things on scale with as many people that live in the metro area, it impacts the water quality that's going down into our river system.
Very good. Well, thank you all so much for joining this important conversation. I really appreciate your time. And if you're interested in helping, email info@kmuw.org to join in our first Community Action Leaders project. We'll be seeking donations of new low-flow shower heads, as well as volunteers to install them and volunteers to receive them, and save 100,000 gallons of water for Wichita over the next 2 years. Again, email info@kmuw.org for more on that project. And you can find the recording of this and other Engage ICT discussions at engageict.org to share with friends and family. Next month, join us in person at Roxy's downtown at 6 p.m. It's Tuesday, July 11th, and we will be talking about the fate of Wichita's performing arts. We're going to talk about performers, venues, and much more. Don't miss it. Again, that will be July 11th at Roxy's. Engage ICT is sponsored by Keith and Georgia Stevens. For KMUW, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo.